still loading. Redirecting. Okay, we should be live.
All right, so we'll give everyone just 1 second to come into the video. If you are here already for, you're just early attender, you could go ahead and say what you're drinking if you've got any tea, but I'll give it about 10 more seconds left. Then we'll get started.
I've got sweet orange tea from Tazo Tea. How about you?
I drank all my tea and I have black coffee.
Perfect.
Moment of honesty there. Got the black coffee. All right, so I think that's probably long enough. So thanks everyone for being here. It's 2021, the very first episode of the new year. This is our What's the Tea show. Every single Tuesday at 2 p.m. we either talk with a staff member or someone who works with SSFS about what they do or just information related to our work that we think you might find useful. And today we're going to talk about substance use and the overlap with domestic violence. I know it's a brand new year, so people are making New Year's resolutions and often cutting back on something like drinking is one of them. So we think it's a good time to do this episode. Also, anecdotally, I've heard people are drinking more just because we're locked inside our homes. So maybe get some more information. But I think we'll keep this as a conversation. I want to mention that usually we do a one-side interview, but me and Kerry will switch back and forth. So I'll let Kerry get us started, and thanks, Kerry, for being on this episode.
Heck yeah, thanks for having me on tea, Zach. So we're talking today about the intersection of substance use disorders and domestic violence. And one of the things that's going to emerge as a thread, I think, in our conversation today is what a heightened risk substance use disorders can pose when we're talking about domestic violence. Since in domestic violence, just we're all on the same page, the working definition our agency uses is that domestic violence is the deliberate pattern of abusive behaviors used by one person to maintain power and control over another within the context of a relationship. So this can include all types of abuse, but the crux that we're really going to need to keep in mind for our conversation today is that this is about maintaining power and control over somebody else. And when we have substance use disorders as a part of those folks' lived experiences, that creates a lot of heightened risk for abuse and a heightened risk for less safety and less ability to prevent harm. And so we're going to just, I think, kind of talk about how that intersects there. Zach, do you have sort of a working definition of substance use disorders so that folks can follow along with us?
So I do. And I guess the reason I hesitated was there doesn't always need to be like a diagnosis or anything like that. So I'll talk about working definition and some of the characteristics, whether it's been diagnosed by someone. So it's usually a pattern of symptoms resulting from the inability to stop using a substance or continuing to use them despite having negative consequences. So if someone you think might have one, usually interferes with important functions like the inability to hold down a job or to maintain positive social relationships, and even not doing things that recreationally that someone would like to do. So there's one aspect of it is tolerance. Basically, tolerance is needing larger amounts of the substance to achieve the same result. So that's one thing we might notice. Another one is withdrawal symptoms, where there's a craving to use the substance even when it's not appropriate to do so. Those will keep increasing as well. And a few other things. So as I said, continuing to use when it's still a problem is a big one. And the severity, it could be it could be a mild symptom, it could be very severe. So it varies, but for the purposes of the overlap with DV, whether it's mild or severe, it still plays a big and important role.
Mhm.
So I think I'll stop there. I don't want to get too much into it.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about maybe some of the myths and facts revolving substance abuse, and maybe we can.
Yeah,
circle
absolutely.
around. Do you
But
want
one
to
thing, absolutely, before I get there, I just want to thank you for pointing out getting a diagnosis that you do or don't have a substance use disorder is really not the main point in this issue. Just as it's not necessarily important that when somebody's experiencing domestic violence, that everybody agrees that we are going to call this domestic violence. What's important is, what are people living with? What are people able to do or not do? How are their lives impacted adversely because of what is happening in their lives? And that's true whether we're talking about living with a violence or whether we're talking about living with substance use that is unmanaged or dysfunctional in some way. It doesn't necessarily matter that we label it with a diagnosis, but that we recognize the reality of what people are living with and how that's impacting their experiences. And most importantly, how they're able to make choices and remain safe and to flourish in their lives. So I really appreciate that you made that disclaimer. But moving on to myths and facts, the one that always jumps out to me is I often hear people say, that they were violent towards a partner because they were high, because they were drunk, because they were using some substance, and putting the blame for their abusive act on whatever substance they're using, whether that again rises to a substance use disorder or it's just they got drunk one night and they never otherwise drink, whatever it is. And so that goes to this idea of causation, right? The concept or the myth that substance use or substance use disorders cause domestic violence. It's a huge myth, and it's very dangerous because we know in domestic violence that when somebody is doing harm to their partner, to their child, to their family member, that's a choice they're making. And so when we scapegoat our substance use for a choice to be violent, abusive, harmful to someone, then we aren't taking accountability for that action. And then if we don't take accountability for that choice and that action, we have no impetus to make different choices going forward. So we're going to continue our abuse because it's the drug's fault, it's the booze's fault, right? So it's very important to recognize that there is not a causal relationship between substance use and domestic violence. What there is a correlation. And the best way I understand the concept of this correlation is simply that where we have domestic violence, we're more likely to also have substance use and substance use disorders. Where we have substance use and substance use disorders, we're more likely to have domestic violence, so that they tend to intersect, but not first this, then that, right? But that they sort of weave in together. And so that's, to me, one of the most important myths that we need to address whenever we talk about this topic, is that no, your substance use is not causing you to be violent. And from another point of view, if you're the survivor in that relationship, if you have a substance use disorder, your substance use disorder is not causing you to be abused. This is someone's choice to do violence to you. And so identifying that correlation, I think, can just move a lot of that fog out of the conversation. And this is what we're really talking about, the choice to do violence to someone else. And so then when we bring in substance use disorders, then we can have the conversation that's relevant and very important, which is, how is the substance disorder heightening your risk to be violent or to experience violence?
Absolutely.
How about for you? What are some of the myths and facts that really always stand out to you?
I've got one more. I do want to say one other thing about this one, because it just rang a bell in my head when you said it, because we talk about this in prevention with K through 12, and starting in junior high, we try to get this point across. But one thing that we try so hard to avoid is them being like, oh, well, we could just drink then, because it's not causing the violence. So
okay.
This is one of our big, we see this myth all the time when we go into the schools, so it's something we try to dispel as well. So the one, hopefully this makes sense to adults as well, but we like to say, well, does every DV situation have drinking? And the answer is no. And does every drinking situation have violence? And the answer is no. So we know that there's that correlation as you explained, but if there's cases where they're not both there, then there's something else going on.
Yeah, that's such a clear way to put it.
We had to refine it for the kids, so
Hey, refine it for me. Yeah, bring it to its basics, Zach. I like it.
and I also for my myth I wanted to bring up was how kids are not affected. So I think there's two different things how this plays out. So one is domestic violence in general. There's that myth where it doesn't affect the kids, but we know that if you're in the family, even if you just hear it, it definitely has effects later in life. And specifically for kids with DV and substance abuse in the home, it's that same correlation that you explained, except for kids later in life. So if there is substance abuse in the home, there's an increased risk that they will have intimate partner violence later in life. And if there's that in the household, there's an increased risk for substance abuse later in life. So unfortunately, they are affected just as well.
Absolutely. It's so important to me, the impacts on children, because often there's, exactly as you described it, there's this myth that out of sight, then they're not really getting impacted. If they don't see me drinking or using, if they don't see me hurting my partner, if they don't see me getting hurt by my partner, then they're not impacted. And evidence-based work shows that that is not true. Children, particularly young children, K through 5, or not even K through 5, infancy through 5, their brains are sponges. And even those first several years, even before they're at just 5 years old, they're soaking in every piece of information, whether it's coming through their eyes, their ears, their noses, their taste, all of their 5 senses, and also just their emotional sense. They feel the emotional atmosphere in their homes and in their spaces, and their brains are processing that information and doing the best they can with it. And so if their parents are under the influence, they're going to perceive their parents in that way, and their brain is going to make whatever sense it can make out of that information that it will. And it doesn't matter if they didn't see them take the drink. It matters how they experience their parents' behaviors, their parents' attachment to them. Do they feel safe in their parents' arms, or is it precarious because they're not in their faculties? All of those kind of things are impacting children. So we tend to think as adults, oftentimes I hear adults say this kind of thing, is that we think of children learning and understanding information the way we as adults do, which is in a very like, I read it, I saw it, I heard it, then I know it. And that's not necessarily how children learn things. So I'm really glad you talked about those impacts.
And I've got another one.
Yeah, good.
It relates back to a general DV myth that it's like a sickness, or that it's like a psychopathology or something like that. But we know that it's a learned behavior, especially with the high correlation. If you see it in the household, you're likely to fall into that pattern statistically. And I think that's the same. Well, it's a little bit different with substance use, because with like alcohol, for example, it affects your brain, and addiction gets to a point where it's a medical issue at a certain point, and it's with the brain. But if you try to correlate that back to DV, it just doesn't work, because we know that it's a choice to be abusive. So I wanted to clear that up as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that addiction issues are considered a disease, something that we treat medically through a variety of treatment options, right? There's not just you take this pill kind of a thing, but like any complex medical issue, it's something we treat, accessing lots of established medical treatments. Whereas with domestic violence, exactly as you're saying, this is a learned behavior. This goes into my core belief set, why I think it's appropriate or even my right to be violent to a partner. Why, if I'm a survivor, I think I deserve the abuse I'm receiving. These are all learned things, not a medical issue. So I really appreciate you drawing that distinction, because it goes straight to that correlation causation issue, as you're saying. And it also goes straight to how do you get supports depending on what it is that you're living with. One of them that always stands out to me, and it goes exactly to the point you were just making, is the idea that if we fix the substance use disorder, then the domestic violence will go away. And as you just pointed out, that's not going to work because we don't support recovery in those situations in the same way, right? We're treating a substance use disorder. I might get sober. I might stop using whatever my drug of choice is, and I might be in treatment for that. Say I'm going to 12-step, and I also have individual therapy, whatever my treatment package looks like, and I feel really supported and I'm not using and I'm very stable in my sobriety. I can still be very abusive to my partner because it's a separate issue, right? They correlate, as we've said, and my substance use disorder is going to add complicating factors that I'm sure we'll get to as we continue chatting, but I can still be making choices to harm my partner or my family or anyone, you know, because I've learned and I've incorporated into my core belief system that it's appropriate for me to use violence to manage my relationships in some way. So that's another myth that I think always stands out to me, is like, if we treat the substance use, then this will go away. And that simply isn't borne out by evidence-based work or anecdotal work with clients.
Absolutely. Did you have any more myths that you wanted to dispel before we move on?
It's a strange thing to call my favorites, but those are some of the real standout myths and facts to me that always I hear repeatedly from people that are new to these topics. Yeah. So I'm going to take a quick drink. I was thinking maybe we could start talking about how the different ways that substance use disorders impact people living with domestic violence. Is that a good segue for you?
Yeah.
Okay,
I've got
good.
a little chart here that I can share.
Super.
Okay.
Fantastic chart. Thank you.
I am now sharing my screen.
Super. So
Okay.
what I would say as we start to get into this, and definitely jump in anytime, Zach, is that you see that middle column, substance abuse and domestic violence similarities. These are a lot of sort of the things that come into play: feelings, emotions, experiences, community systems that come into play, whether you're dealing with domestic violence and or dealing with substance use disorders. And we wanted to just make a graphic for you. Zach's pulled together this graphic for you that takes a look on both sides of that power and control dynamic, right? So we have some of the effects on victims or survivors of domestic violence that are living with either or both substance use disorders and domestic violence. And we've got effects on perpetrators or people who use violence against their intimate partners or family members on the other end. And so, Zach, what stands out to you? Like, what are some of these that really clicked for you where you see the heightened risk?
Sure. I'll point out a couple. I'm looking at the loss of support system is a big one. We know one power and control tactic is to isolate someone from their friends and family. So there's more of a reliance on the abuser.
Yeah.
And how it looks on the victim side is they, and this could be both. It doesn't matter who really has a substance abuse problem for some of these. It could be either person, but there's an increased reliance on the drug of choice for a victim. And on the other side, there's no one challenging either type of abuse on the perpetrator side.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that stands out to me. Also, relapse, which is, it's pretty much, it's common for people who are trying to cut back or quit. And unfortunately, that could be a very vulnerable time for the victim. Once they relapse, unfortunately, they could be blamed for the abuse, and that could be used to say, well, you're back doing a substance or you're back drinking, so you deserve it, which of course we know is not true, but that might be something that's being said. And on the abuser side, unfortunately, if there's a relapse, that can be increased lethality and frequency of abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something that stands out as listening to you is it doesn't matter which person or if both people are the ones having a substance use disorder or using substances at all. It could be the survivor or victim. It could be the person using violence. It could be both of those people. But what happens when you are living with addiction issues, right? Let's think about the cyclical nature of that. One of the things that stood out to me in our opening when we were kind of talking about definitions of what's the definition of domestic violence? What's the definition of substance use disorder? The word in common that both of us said was pattern. So what's the pattern with substance use disorders, right? Is that there are very physical and emotional processes that are happening when you have a substance use disorder. You're addicted to the substance you're using, your drug of choice, but you're also emotionally addicted to the emotional and physical experience that drug gives you when you are high or drunk, or when that drug's in your system, right? And so that creates that pattern of, I want to get high, I need to get high, using, feeling the expected and anticipated sensations and associated emotional states. And then you're going to have withdrawal. You're going to come out of that space physically and emotionally. And so then that creates that pattern, right? And so what do we know about that cycle of violence with domestic violence? With domestic violence, where we have that tension building stage, right? Where we're in this relationship and one partner is using violence against the other partner and they're experiencing that tension, right? The abusive partner is escalating their negative emotional state. They're doing a lot of blaming and taking things out on their partner, which escalates into that explosion of an acute abusive incident, right? And then coming down into that honeymoon stage. So they're not the same cycle, but they're both cyclical in nature. Right. And so to me, that really stands out about, if both of us have a substance use disorder, what's that doing in our tension building stage? What's that doing in our dynamic of power and control? If I'm someone who uses violence with my partner and I have a substance use disorder, what's my emotional state if I can't get drunk? I can't get my hands on my drug of choice. I'm agitated. I might have physical impacts. I might have withdrawals, physical withdrawal symptoms. And what's that going to do, right? Exactly as you say, if I then relapse? What's that going to do if I've isolated my partner and my partner is the one with a substance use disorder? If he or she or they are needing their drug of choice or wanting to be high, how is their ability to perceive risk from me going to be impacted? They might not necessarily see when I'm getting angry because their focus is on their addiction issue. And that really stands out to me in listening to the ones you've highlighted here.
Yeah, that's a great point. How it interplays with the cycle of violence that we see, and we've got coexisting patterns here. There was maybe one or two more that I wanted to point out. The police response is one. So unfortunately, if both people are abusing substances, that can appear to be not a power and control dynamic happening. And on the surface, maybe someone sees that it's like a wash or something, like, oh, you're both abusing drugs, you must both be abusing each other. But that would be another myth, I would say. Just because both parties are using substances, we know that that doesn't mean that domestic violence is somehow not about power and control or something like that.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to echo you. I mean, I would think if I'm a responding officer, which I don't know anything about being a responding officer, that's never been something I've done. But if I'm somehow dealing with two people who are high or drunk and combative with each other, it might be very difficult for me to ascertain whether this is an effect of whatever they're using or if this is a domestic violence dynamic. And if I'm dealing with people who are under the influence of something, I'm probably not going to get very clear guidance or clarity from them. And so it can be very easy for me in that position to just assume or infer that this is just some people under the influence and it'll be fine once they sober up. And I might miss signs that there's domestic violence going on and therefore not be responsive in that way.
Yes, and unfortunately, if that's echoed to the people in the relationship, they might buy that as well.
Good point, Zach. Yeah.
And so I don't think I'll read the rest of them, but there's a lot of rationalization as well. You know, using substances to rationalize the abuse or to kind of talk your way out of taking responsibility for using the abuse. That's there as well, which goes in part with magical thinking, like the abuse will stop if I stop drinking is a big one that can be on both sides. But
Mhm.
I'm going to let us stop sharing the screen so we can continue. Okay, I think we're back.
Super.
So,
So go ahead, please.
I'll just say before you go, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to enter those now before we'll probably get to them in a minute here.
Terrific. So thanks for the graphic. And Zach, would you, after the interview, would you just post that graphic in the comments in case anybody wanted to take a look at it after the episode?
Sure.
Super great. We'll also be putting in the comments our hotline number, and we'll be putting in a nationwide number for substance use disorders and mental health. If you feel that you need supports with those kinds of experiences, the national number can put you in touch with local resources that can help. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how might an abusive partner, somebody who uses violence with their intimate partner, use substance use disorders as a tactic of abuse. And some of the things I've seen in my work, I spent about 3.5 years working in our agency's partner abuse intervention program that works with adult people who use violence with their adult intimate partners to hold them accountable and help them learn nonviolent ways of dealing with tension in their relationships to prevent further violence. I know we featured them several times on T, so longtime T watchers will know what I'm talking about. But in that program, I oftentimes heard our participants, so these are adults who've used violence in their relationships, talking about either or both their experience with substance use disorders or their partners. And I often heard how they manipulated the existence of the substance use disorder to control their partner. And a lot of that would be victim blaming. For example, if you weren't drunk, if you weren't high, and a lot of name calling here, a lot of judgment on their partner's behavior. And if you weren't this, if you weren't doing this, then I wouldn't hurt you. Then, you have this coming because you can't even walk straight line. A lot of that kind of manipulative talk around substance use disorders. I remember one participant was very proud of his sobriety. At the time he was in our group, he had his first month sober, and he put a lot of weight on that achievement and how hard he'd worked. And in the same breath, he said, but my ex is still a junkie. So so that's why I had to hit her. I had to restrain her because she was a junkie. And to me, that always has stood out in my memory of, not to take anything away from his achievement of reaching 1 month of sobriety, but that disconnect of justifying abuse to a partner who didn't have 1 month of sobriety always stood out to me. Perhaps one of the things that really stands out is that perhaps if she wasn't being abused, she could pursue sobriety. She might have had more energy to deal with her substance use disorder. It's something we haven't really talked a lot about yet this episode is that substance use disorders and domestic violence often have a connection in coping with abuse and the trauma impact of living while being abused. People often start using drugs and alcohol or any substance that can make them feel anything other than the pain of the abuse. And I don't just mean physical abuse, I mean the psychological trauma of living with domestic violence. And so that's something that I think often when we're working with folks who do violence to their partners, that we need to help them understand your abuse may be part of the reason that your partner can't get sober, because they're still dealing with that trauma. And this is one of the only ways they have available to them to feel anything different. Again, I'm not trying to justify anybody's substance use disorder, but just to remind us, these are trauma experiences, and that people need a lot of support to create healthy and empowered lives when they've been living with trauma.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's the first time I've heard that, but that's a great point. Especially with the in-person example in the PAPE program, because I was reading the U.S. Department of Justice did a study. It said roughly 61% of domestic violence offenders had a substance abuse problem, so more than half. Was that something that was regularly talked about in the groups, and how to what extent?
Mhm. Well, my memory, it's been several years since I worked in the program, and so I don't know what the current experiences are or the current practices, but we, before folks came into the program, and I know they do still do this, there was part of the screening process and I'm losing my word, the screening process for whether somebody was eligible or appropriate for the program was to talk with them about whether they experienced substance use disorders. And the program regularly would make referrals to treatment programs for folks who met criteria that would indicate they needed that support. But I think what your real question is in group. Yeah, we talked about this, not just because somebody came into group and said, hey, I have a substance use disorder, but because whether they ever identified that for themselves or not, we know that there's such a high correlation, as evidenced by the stat you just shared. And so whether anybody came into group and said, yep, it's me, I'm the one with a substance use disorder, we know just numerically, or just statistically rather, that there's folks in our groups that are dealing with substance use disorders. And so, yeah, we absolutely made that part of the conversations. How would this go if you were using? And then we also had a lot of folks in groups that were simultaneously, I think you'll remember certainly, Zach, from prior episodes with our PAPE manager and staff, that they talk about folks being mandated to come to group because of a domestic violence charge. A lot of the participants in those groups had a simultaneous charge for substance use issues, whether that was a DUI or whether that was using illegal drugs or any of those things. And so a lot of our participants had simultaneous things that they had to report to the criminal justice system on. They either had to report on their progress in the group period, or oftentimes our participants had to report on their participation and progress in our group, as well as do drug testing and all of that as a part of their process. And so this was constant part of those conversations, is how's that impacting your choice to be violent? When you're using, do you make your best choices? When you want your drug of choice and you don't have access to it, what kind of choices do you feel empowered to make? Is that the moment when you're most able to de-escalate yourself emotionally and say, I may not lay hands on my partner, I may not cuss out my partner? And so that was very important to explore with them.
And that sounds like to my ears, the best method, because I know in PAPE, in the partner abuse program, you have a very specific goal, and everyone is there for a very specific reason. Mm-hmm. But as this episode's indicated, you can't really ignore the substance abuse either. So it sounds like a delicate balance.
There's folks that come into PAPE, or folks that are living with domestic violence and or substance use disorders, just need a lot of support. These are very difficult and very complex things that folks are living with. And it's not a simple thing to change in your life. So you're right. No matter whether you are being victimized, you're surviving domestic violence, whether you are doing violence to your partner, you're perpetrating violence, substance use disorders just increase the complexity of changing that norm in your life.
Absolutely. I think from here, we'll maybe go to the questions and ask for our help today. Celeste is helping us. So how are we looking in the comment section?
I am here. I don't see any questions so far, guys.
Okay.
Maybe we can give them another minute.
Sure. I guess while we're giving folks a chance to ask some questions, one of the things I'd really like to leave people with is the idea that when we mix substance use disorders with the experience of domestic violence, we're really talking about heightened risk. And that's heightened risk for increased severity, frequency, and lethality of abuse from a perpetrator or offender side of this dynamic. And we're looking at what's the impact on a survivor or a victimized person in this dynamic if they are using, what happens to their ability to execute a safety plan that they've worked out with a counselor, for example. Will they be able to recall the details of it in a moment if they're also dealing with a substance use disorder? What's their ability to perceive risk or perceive the tension level or lethality level of their partner? Again, it's not their responsibility to make their partner not abuse them, but what's their ability to do something to take protective measures for themselves? And that all gets put at heightened risk when we mix in substance use disorders.
Well said. Anything from Facebook, Celeste?
We have one question. So for those who may be living with DV and substance abuse, how might your services help their, how might your services help their situation?
So to my knowledge, and Kerry, if I, you'll be there. And Celeste, could you tell me if they were a victim? Is that what was that in the question, or is it just in general?
I believe it was in general, possibly for the victim as well as the abuser.
Okay. So on the abuser side, as we were saying, in the PAPE program, substance abuse is something that is talked about openly, but also lots of referrals to other substance abuse treatment facilities. So they would be looked at and treated separately, although you can't really ignore one without the other. And I believe on the victim side, it would likely be the same, depending on the extent of the substance use. We would be able to provide free counseling as we do. And also we have lots of referrals for other programs if they wanted to specifically treat that substance abuse as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Zach. In the assessment process, no matter what program you're accessing, there will be some screening questions related to substance use disorders. The other thing is that both our counseling services and our PAPE services, they're working closely with individuals, with participants, and they're going to be paying attention for red flags or even overt statements that I'm living with substance use issues. And so that's going to be an ongoing thing throughout the therapeutic relationship in counseling and throughout the group relationship in PAPE, where the staff is going to be having frank conversations, confidential, frank conversations with their clients saying, hey, I'm seeing some things that are of concern to me, and can we talk about this? And that referral process is going to be an ongoing option throughout the relationship between the client and the agency and their particular staff members, right? So it's not simply at the assessment time and then never thought of again. This, as I said, is a very complex and a very evolving process for our clients. And so our staff is well educated and prepared and experienced in working with folks to help them identify where they could use extra supports. And we're lucky to have lots of referrals that we can make for folks.
Okay.
A wonderful response. I'm not seeing any more questions.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you, Celeste.
No problem.
Okay. Any closing statements for you, Kerry? Anything that we wanted to get across that we kind of weren't able to fit in?
Just thanks for having me on T again. I've been here a few times. I always like it. And just thanks to our viewers for tuning in. And I hope from this episode you come away with an understanding of how complex these lived experiences are for people, and that they deserve support in promoting their safety and their wellness and their empowerment.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, Kerry. And as she said, we will get some of those links for everyone in the comments if that's something that you would be interested in. Otherwise, thank you for being here and for the comments. We will be here next Tuesday, same time and place, and we will have some different tea for you.
Thank you.